So at Envision, I'm building a custom feature for one of our customers, and it lives outside of our SPAs, our single page applications, and it uses some really old school form post techniques. And these are techniques I've been using for, the better part of 2 decades, but it occurred to me that some of the newer developers out there may not know about some of this stuff. So I thought it'd be fun to put together a little demo. Now, before we get into the full portion of the demo, I think we should build up to it using individual steps. So the first is that if you have a form submission and you have inputs, and those inputs all have the same name, they will be submitted as individual entries in the multi-part form data payload. But on the Cold Fusion side of the workflow, Cold Fusion will take these values and it will coalesce them down into a single form scope entry. By default, that is going to become a list. So let's take a look at how this works. And you'll see at the bottom here, we're just dumping out that form.userid list. So if we come over here into our first example and we hit post, if we look at our network activity, you can see that those 4 hidden inputs are all being submitted as different form data entries. However, on the Cold Fusion side, you can see that those values have all been condensed down into a single list. And you can see that this is a string, so this is a comma delimited list. Now, in Cold Fusion, apparently there is an application CFC setting called same form fields as array, which would convert this from a comma delimited list into an array. But I work primarily with brownfield applications, meaning older legacy applications. I can't just make sweeping changes in my application CFC, as it would break a lot of existing functionality. However, we can change this behavior on a per form basis by changing the syntax a little bit. So if we jump into example 2, we essentially have the same exact input set up, except we're including this special notation where we have the open bracket, close bracket as a suffix on the form field name. And what that's going to do is post back all these values and condense them down into a single value in the form scope, but it's going to be an array instead of a list. So let's look at our example 2. So let's post. And again, if we look in the network activity, we can see that these user ID lists with our open bracket, close bracket suffix has been submitted as separate form data entries. However, on the Cold Fusion side, you can see that these have all now been coalesced into a single user ID list form scope value, except instead of a comma delimited list, we now have an array. So again, this takes that concept of changing the like name values behavior from a list to an array. All right, so next thing we want to step up to is that in addition to inputs, our buttons can also submit form data. By default, if you just have a button with a type submit, all it does is trigger the postback of the form. However, each submit button can also have a name and a value attribute. And what this allows us to do is collect the name value pairs for the button that was used to submit the form to the server. So even though we have 3 different submit buttons here, we're not going to collect the name value pair of each button. We're only going to collect the name value pair of the button that the user actually clicked to submit the form, which means that we can then use these values on the server side to determine what action the user actually took. But in this example, all we're going to do is submit 3 different buttons. Each has the same name action, but a different value. Do this, do that, do the other. And on the server side, we're going to dump out that action value. So let's jump into example 3. And we can see do this. We have do this, and we can see down here that that action was submitted as action do this. If we hit do that, you can see that we have do that, and you can see action do that was submitted. And one more time on the do other, you can see that the do other action was submitted. So what we've seen so far is that we have situations in which like named form fields will be submitted and coalesced into a single value on the Cold Fusion side. We've seen that if we use this special open bracket, close bracket suffix notation, that behavior will change from coalescing down to a single list to coalescing down to a single array. And we've seen that we can use name values on submit buttons in order to submit special data to the form to the Cold Fusion side, but only for the button that the user clicked. So taking all of that behavior, which is basically part of the HTML form spec, and of course interplay with the way Cold Fusion handles form submission data on the back end. And now we can easily manage user ID lists or collections of data using form posts. So let's now look at our final demo, which is based on what I'm building at work. And the idea here is we're going to have a collection of user IDs, and then we're going to be able to add user IDs to this collection and remove user IDs from this collection. Before we look at the code, let's just take a look at the demo itself so we get a sense of what's taking place. So you can imagine that this would be some sort of like a pre-processing curation page where a user might be presented with a list of data, and then they can review it, add data to it, remove data to it, and then eventually do some sort of final processing. So let's just start adding some data. And you can see here we're able to build up this collection of IDs. Let's go ahead and remove the even values. So we're going to remove 2 and 4. Let's add another one, 6. And let's just remove a bunch of these. And now let's just clear it out. And of course, we can just keep adding things. So what we're seeing here is that the existing list of IDs is being maintained across each one of these actions, right? When I go to add the 5th value here, we're not losing 1 through 4. We're maintaining 1 through 4. And then as we remove values, you can see that we're, of course, maintaining the values that we already had, less the value that we're explicitly removing. And we're using a button here to submit the form back to remove a specific value. Notice that nothing here is ever being passed in the URL. But if we look closer at what's actually happening behind the scenes, so if we look, let's go remove 2, and we look at the network activity for that, what we can see is happening is that on each one of these interactions, we're submitting the new user ID, that's this input. We're submitting the remove user ID, that's the specific button within the list that was clicked. And then we're submitting all of the existing user IDs for one for each row here. And we're going to be doing that using hidden form fields. And we're using that open bracket, close bracket syntax so that we're going to manage these as an array on the Cold Fusion side. So now that we see what's happening, let's take a look at the Cold Fusion code to see how this all comes together. So again, we have our new user ID, we have our remove user ID. This is going to be the way that we update and mutate that collection of IDs. Here's the user IDs. You can see we're defaulting to an array. We're expecting to use this value as an array on the Cold Fusion side. We're going to keep the interaction here super simple. So we're not going to worry about validation or anything like deduping of values. If we have a new user ID, we're just going to go ahead and append that to the array. If we have a remove user ID, we're just going to go ahead and delete that value from the array. If we had duplicates, it'll leave in the duplicates, but it'll remove one at a time. Again, we're just trying to keep it as simple as possible. But we're able to keep it simple as possible because we're using basic but sturdy and durable behaviors of the HTML form spec, as well as the way Cold Fusion handles data. So we have our new user input. That's just a vanilla input, nothing very interesting about that. Really, where things become interesting is inside of our loop as we're looping over the collection of IDs. Inside of each TR table row, we have a hidden input that is going to post back the ID in this row. And again, we're using the special notation here to make sure that this user ID's value shows up as an array in the form scope. And then we're using a named submit button with the remove user ID, and you can see that the value for this button is the ID that we want to remove. So as I talked about earlier, when we have submit buttons with name value pairs and the user clicks on it, we submit the name value pair as part of the form submission, but we only do that for the button that was clicked. So even though each row in this table has a button, we don't submit each name value pair for each button. We only submit the name value pair for the one we're removing, right? So if I hit the one for 4 and we look at the network activity, we're only getting that name value pair for 4. And that's basically all there is to it, right? Here's the submit, doesn't have a name value pair, so we don't really get a post back there. But it all comes together to make managing this data across multiple form posts super, super easy. And again, I've been using these techniques for the better part of 2 decades now, and they're just great. I mean, I don't even think about it anymore. I only put this together because I'm so mired in single page applications lately that falling back to this quote unquote old school form post back workflow just was a fun change of scenery. And again, it occurred to me that maybe some newer developers don't have this ready to go as second nature. So hopefully there was something new and exciting here for some of the newer developers, and for the older developers, just a moment to celebrate how easy Cold Fusion makes managing form data and processing form requests from our users. Just another thing that makes this language so gosh darn joyful.